Okay, can you hear me now? Let's see if anybody can hear me now. I've changed the sound settings. Whoa! Right, that's Sarah Bell for the win. Thanks, Sarah. So I've been sat here for half an hour making sure everything's perfect. And you can still mess it up. Okay. Okay, thank you very much for joining me. Let's oh! Hi. Let's see what we're going to do. I'm obviously going to do this safe. So no, I'm not. Let's not do that. Okay, so welcome to my little bit of how to do maps stuff. As somebody said, my accent's a little funny. Yeah, that's because I'm from somewhere else in the world. Although I'm currently sat in my office at Esri in a very non-air conditioned facility. But I thought I'd do it from here rather than home, just because my dog wouldn't have been the best co-presenter in the world. He'd have been better than John Nelson, but not as good as a lot of people. So let's get into this. I've got loads to do, loads to share. Let's have a little bit of fun with this. So, as many of you know, I moved to the US in 2011 after spending a couple of decades in the UK, and I've always been interested in thematic mapping and teaching about maps, and I've always loved political mapping, partly because every few years the map landscape changes and you start to get new data sets and a new sense of what you can do with the map. And so when I arrived in the States, I thought, well, what better way to start to understand a little bit about the geography of the States and the geography of the political landscape than start to make maps. So I began making maps of the 2012 election between Obama and Romney, and that enabled me to start to look at things. And then, of course, when we get up to 2016, then we have a completely different scenario, right? We have Trump and Clinton. So I started making maps of Trump and Clinton. So let's just dive straight in, and I'm going to spend some time talking through a whole slew of maps that help to perhaps understand what's going on with the political landscape. But to be honest, I'm not really that interested in going into that today. I'm going to be looking more at the different cartographic techniques you can do with thematic mapping, and how you can take pretty much one data set and apply it to a whole series of different techniques. I'm just going to pause a second. There's a few people saying that they're struggling to see my screen. You should be seeing a window with ArcGIS Pro in it, and it seems to be coming through okay in my feed. Okay, you should be seeing a screen with ArcGIS Pro in it, with me right down in that bottom little corner. Okay, does anybody want to confirm that? Okay, thanks for that. Okay, so here we go. Here's the states of the United States, and that's the map, right? That's the result. The red one. There's not as much blue. Job done. We can all go home. That's the map. Well, I mean, it's kind of the map that you see in many places, but there are kind of a few problems with this. The map is pretty limited in what it says. It's basically first past the post, who won. Although technically it's correct, it's the right result, right? But I don't particularly like this map for one reason, and that reason is the glory that be Web Mercator. and I'm not really going to spend any much more time on this. I'm not going to spend much more time on this, other to say it's pretty horrendous. Webmacator for any thematic map or most thematic maps is a pretty poor choice. So let's not bother with it. Let's go over and have a look at. Oh, isn't that so much better? It's like the map all of a sudden soothes you, just like this lozenge is going to soothe my throat, I think. So just selecting an appropriate projection. This is Alva's equal area. It does a wonderful job of creating much more aesthetically pleasing and soothing map. I mean, picking a projection for that suits your particular part of the world goes a long way to making a more effective mapping product. Great time to have a coughing fit, Ken. What else is going on here? We put Alaska and Hawaii down at the bottom of the map. They become their own insets. So, and they're now to scale with all of the rest of the states. So the big thing about an Alva's equal area projection is exactly that. It's equal area. So each of the states is in the same proportion to each other states, and you don't get a visual exaggeration of any one state over any other state. So technically speaking, you're seeing the correct amount of colour or pattern, and that provides a very sensible way of looking at the data. Okay, so we've got unique values. That's the state view. You can already see down on the left. I don't know how far we're going to get through this. If I collapse in a coughing fit, not very far, but we'll see. Of course, unique values for states only tells us some of the information. Maybe we want to go down to dig a little deeper and look at the county level. And that's kind of interesting because it proves to us that geography is really pretty important in explaining and exploring aspects of the political geography or the data set that we're looking at. So even though we've got an overall state count and a state win, I guess there's going to be pockets in every state, pretty much every state, that actually buck the trend. Now, this is kind of interesting if you recall some of the memes that were going around. This is one of the maps that went around with the "try to impeach this" message. And the very simple idea behind that is look at all the red. I mean, it's absolutely all over the place, and there are really just pockets of blue. So really what we're seeing is a slightly more detailed view of exactly the same data. But it's still just telling us basically who won first past the post. Okay, moving on to I'm getting an awful lot of lag on my side of things. I do apologise. There we go. So, moving on to a unique values single colour map. Isn't this the result? There's really only one winner in an election. So you could effectively paint the entire map red and say that this is the win, if you wanted to. It depends kind of what message you want to actually portray with your map. We could move on to perhaps something a little bit more interesting with various pattern fills. you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to kill some of these extra things that are going on my desktop, and let's see if we can get it to speed up a little bit. Okay. Pattern fills. Why does everything have to be a block of colour? Why does everything have to be red or blue? Well, it doesn't. I mean, it depends kind of what your audience is. If you're mapping for a print publication or for a website, of course you're more likely to go for the red or the blue. It's a traditional colour palette, at least over the last 20 or so years, and it does reflect the different parties, the different candidates. But I mean, you could be playful. This is a map that takes a swatch of a little Armani suit and a shock of blonde hair and plays with it a little bit. But of course, you don't have to go that crazy. You know, you could actually just use a traditional pattern fill, dots maybe for Democratic and hashed lines for Republican. And that again tells us the sort of unique value story. But what happens if we change some of the sizing of the dots and the spacing of the dots and the different application of lines to the map? I mean, this is really just replicating something that we might have seen in print cartography maybe 20 or 30 years ago, with dots and lines being drawn photomechanically or even sometimes manually. And we start to see not just difference here, but also some sort of empirical or quantitative difference. We see that there are some dot patterns that are darker than others. And really all we've got here is just a pattern version of the modern Choropleth. The modern Choropleth, oh my word, look at that. I mean, that's a modern Choropleth for you. It's one of my favourite topics, this. I'll mention it briefly. If you look at that without really knowing the data set that I'm exploring with you, you'll notice that you can't really recognise anything. It's just a whole slew of rainbow colours. What's high, what's low, what's at one end of a spectrum, what's at the other end of a spectrum. And it really doesn't help us very much, and looks really somewhat ugly. So let's just dive into Choropleth maps to start with. Because they're a very common mapping technique, and it's often the default mapping technique that people will veer towards. So here's a map of just the Republican share of the vote, okay? And you know, you can see where there's an awful lot of Republican activity in various counties, particularly in the southwest, down in Florida, up in the northeast, and that's great. And many of you will be looking at and going, well, that's not exactly what happened, is it? Well, think about it. If you're going to map where the greatest number of Republican voters are, they're likely to be in the largest populated areas, just as much as the Democratic vote, just because there's a lot of people that live there. So if you know the data and know the patterns, you'll probably understand the map a little better. If you don't, then you're going to be misled, because this map is mapping totals. And if I change the map to show the normalized version, which is normalized by the voting population, then you get a very, very different view of the share of the vote for the Republican Party. And that northeast, southwest, northwest, major Democratic strongholds are now faded out on the Republican map, and you get this great big swathe down the centre of the country. So I won't go on about it at length, but you know, one of my big sort of rules of cartography, in fact, it's probably the only rule. You know, most things are just really just best practices and things that we've learned over the years. But one rule, possibly the only rule, is if you're going to use Choropleth maps as your mapping technique, then you really do need to think about converting your data into a rate. So normalize the rate itself, and you get the map that tells the story of the intensity of the share of vote, so that we can properly compare one area from another, regardless of the size of the county or the size of the underlying population. We're taking them out of the equation by normalizing them. But even once we've done that, there are many other decisions. So this is classified, or the data is classified or binned into a series of classes under a scheme called natural breaks, and that's not the only technique we could use. Here's a map that displays quantiles. Here's a map that displays exactly the same data using equal interval. And here's a map that uses manual interval. And let's not go through them all. The point I wanted to raise here was to really say that you could make a map tell whatever kind of story you wanted it to tell, simply through the classification that you apply to the data set. And it's kind of important to understand a little bit about each of those different classification techniques. And we could probably spend an hour on that, but I would just simply encourage you, if you're going to experiment with Choropleth maps, then do a little bit of background work on all of these different techniques and experiment and see which ones actually work for the data set and the distribution of the data across the range that you're experimenting with. Okay, but we've just looked at Republican votes, right? And in order to look at the Democratic vote, we would have to create another map, or do we? What happens if we effectively say, let's just map the counties that the Republicans won with a shade of red, and let's map the counties that the Democrats won with a shade of blue, and each going from light to dark. So now we've got two pieces of information on the map, each one scaled empirically using a different classification scheme. And in fact, it's what we call a diverging hue color scheme. And in fact, I've gone with an equal interval here, just for simplicity's sake, and there's 5 different classes above and below for the Democrats and for the Republicans in red. As an aside, this is the map that President Trump put on his wall in the White House when he took office, and got an awful lot of flack for it. And a lot of people were sort of saying, well, this map is not really telling the truth, and there's an awful lot of red on it, and perhaps there's a more truthful map. Now, while I might agree, in principle, this map isn't incorrect, and if I were a Republican president, I would be putting exactly the same map on the wall to show the depth and spread of the Republican victory. So maps can weave very different stories depending on the technique you use and the ways in which you vary the parameters that the map type affords you. Okay, so that's the Choropleth diverging hue. We can change things a little bit and maybe go with a more purple map. And some people prefer this, some people don't like this map. Instead of going from a light red to a dark red, or from a light blue to a dark blue, we're now just going from blue through red on a kind of a continuous spectrum with a mixed purple in the middle. The idea being that if you're mixing red with blue, you're going to get a purple. And in many senses, this map does actually show that a lot of the United States, or a lot of counties, were actually very marginal, very bipartisan. There were very few counties that you would actually say are at the very extreme end of partisanship. So a map that uses this colour scheme could be used to tell a slightly different story. Okay, blended hue. Unclassed. This is where every single county gets its very own colour. And I'll just be open here, I don't particularly like the technique. It tends to me to smudge a lot of data into very similar colours. But what it is pretty good at is picking out perhaps outliers, those at the very ends of the range of data that you're working with. Now we're going to get into something that I do particularly like. This is the Choropleth value by alpha technique. And really it starts with one of the ordinary sort of either diverging or blended hue choropleths as a base, and just adds another layer on top. And there's a number of different ways you might do that, but here's just one, is adding another layer. Simple as that. And this additional layer is now starting to modify the focus of the data, because what it's actually doing is muting a lot of the areas where there's a low population density. And that has the effect of bringing into focus, particularly over on the west coast and over on the east coast, down through the Midwest, a lot of the areas with a high population density, where perhaps you might argue that there are more votes, therefore the votes count to a greater extent when they're added up. I think particularly it also provides a nice aesthetic to the overall appearance. So that's value by alpha, the use of an additional layer to modify the underlying map. But why do we have to look at all the data? Why don't we just take a look at the counties that flipped in 2016? And in many ways, this is the story of that particular election. It's how many of the counties which then convert into state level results flipped from Democrat to Republican, or curiously, there are a few that flipped from Republican to Democrat, which was a surprise to me, but it's kind of interesting that you do see still those anomalies in what you might otherwise think was a very big swing towards Republican. So for some, this might be the story. Maybe even if you're planning another election, maybe you target. Maybe you start to look at some of these counties and say, these are the places that we do need to motivate an electorate. So instead of looking at the whole map, why not simply just look at some very, very key places on the map? And a similar approach was used by my colleague John Nelson, who basically replicated a technique that Tim Wallace had used when he was at the New York Times. He did map on Trump's America and Clinton's America. And really all he did was a definition query to pick out counties that were of a certain character. And this is what John did here. He picked out counties where the difference, the margin of victory, was less than 5%, less than 5 percentage points. And he called this blended America because this is really just a case of which counties are so marginal that it's going to perhaps go one way or the other. Your neighbours over the white picket fence, you can have a chat to them. It doesn't matter which way they voted because you're all pretty similar in character. And I like this idea of just bringing out or teasing out a certain subset of the data to play with. Okay, I'm going to leave the Choropleth by now. I've spent quite some time on it because it's one of the major mapping techniques. But if you really don't want to convert your total data into rates or percentages, then you could go with a different mapping technique altogether. So if you want to keep your data as a total, or you have a data set that is totals, then a technique that might be useful for you is the graduated symbol map. And here we've got each of a series of classified symbols. There are actually 5 of them that encompass a range of voting totals. And we can colour them blue, we can colour them red, so that we have a secondary piece of information to add to the size. Now, why can you map totals using this technique? Well, it's because the actual area of the symbol is in some way taking the value of the data. And it's a consistent shape, unlike geography, unlike geographical units. So it works. Of course, it also has some downsides. I mean, you can't get away from the fact that you've got to deal with a lot of overlaps, perhaps here in the northeast, that do present some problems. In a multi-scale environment, of course, you could disentangle them if you zoom in and you fix your symbol size. It's going to take too long to draw. I'm going to go back out. And that in some respects is a classified version of a symbol map. I actually prefer the proportional symbol map, where each symbol takes on its own very different size based on the actual value that it's mapping. So when this re-renders, you'll see that it's the same sort of principle, but now each symbol for each county has got its own particular size. Now you have to play around a little bit with this so that you don't get massive outliers impacting the map with huge circles or lots of minuscule little circles. And this, I think, is a decent balance, but there are still issues. So, for instance, you have to deal with the problem of overlaps. And sometimes if you use transparency, such as here down in the sort of southwest, the overlap creates a sort of a false darkness or a false darker shade in the colouring. Now, that can sometimes be perceived as more, when in fact it's just an artifact of the symbol choices that you make. But you've got to deal with it somehow, right? The other difficulty with these sort of maps is if you zoom right in and your maps stay at a sort of a screen scale, then you'll end up finding that the symbol actually appears to look like it points to a very specific location, and that clearly isn't the case. This is just an arbitrary position for a symbol placed within an area and mapping that area. So different treatments for proportional symbols. Well, circles are possibly the most commonly used because they're one of the most popular and easy on the eye shapes that you could get. And we just switch to squares and you'll have a reaction to this one way or the other. Does it help or hinder? Instead of using transparency, I've gone with a completely transparent background and just simply using the outline of the shape, the symbol. Now the problem with this, I guess, is that if you don't really understand where the symbol is located, you might disassociate it with the precise county that it's actually illustrating, and you still, have problems up here in the northeast with all these overlaps. So I mentioned multi-scale mapping before. Yeah, if you can zoom into larger scales, then these symbols can disentangle, and that's a great use of a web map. Otherwise, if it's for print, you might possibly have to go with an inset map of some sort for these very, very crowded areas. And you can have a bit of fun. You don't need to use proportional symbols that are just geometric shapes, the sort of standard cartographic shapes. You can go with perhaps a symbol that reflects some of the character of the theme that you're mapping. So here we have the sort of Republican elephants facing right and the Democratic donkeys facing left, sized proportionally to, in fact, I think this is electoral college votes, if I recall rightly. So you can be a little bit playful with symbols. When you're working with symbols like this, of course, people find it very difficult to get actual values of information back or recover that data. And that, again, is one of the drawbacks of this technique. But as with each of the maps, as you're probably getting a sense of as we go through a lot of this, then it's always a compromise, right? Everything's a compromise as we go through it. So moving away from proportional symbols into dot density. So dot density I like because it actually overcomes some of the problems and the drawbacks of the Choropleth technique because we're not using a solid fill. Each of the counties is basically filled with a series of randomly placed dots that each take on a value. So perhaps 100 people is represented by each of these dots, and each dot is of a similar size. And that gives us that sort of sense of intensity of voting behaviour. When you start to see this map fill in and redraw, you start to see mixing of red dots and blue dots to get the sort of purpley mid-tones that you might expect from a bipartisan county, or you might see little peaks of fairly blue or peaks of fairly red shining through where you've got something a little bit more partisan going on in each of the counties. And it's not quite finished drawing as yet, so we'll just wait for it to just clean up a little bit just to get the final map. But you can still see as this is drawing that we're now we're still looking at counties as a shape. So we're still looking at shapes that exhaust geographical space, even though populations are not necessarily distributed evenly across those geographical spaces. And a great example is San Bernardino County, right down here in the bottom left. I'm actually currently sat in an office about there. Great time to redraw. But San Bernardino County is not that densely populated. It's got huge swathes of desert in it, yet symbology exhausts that entire space evenly, even though it's dot density, and I would argue that it's a much nicer approach than a block-filled Choropleth. Okay, that's nearly finished drawing, but I'm going to scoop out of this now. I would click on this one here called Dasymetric dot density, but I know it's going to take 30 minutes to draw. So rather than that, let's go out to the web map version and show you what a Dasymetric dot density map looks like. It's exactly the same data that we've been working with, but now it's been reapportioned statistically to just areas that are, broadly speaking, populated, urbanized, if you like, and it smooshes all of that data into places where people live and vote and work, not all of the empty space in between. And if we sort of zoom in, the map will redraw with a different scale of dot size and dot value, and you can see just how much empty space there actually is. In fact, this is kind of San Bernardino County in here, and I was talking about how much little space there, little urbanization there is in the county as a whole only a moment ago. Okay, I like that map. It works really well, but of course people are going to say to me, well, it looks like any other map of any other population data set that you might create a Dasymetric map from for the US, and you're absolutely correct. So any map, any thematic data that you use this technique on is going to end up looking somewhat like just a very detailed population map of the United States. And again, that's a compromise. Is this a better map for showing the data for the election or not? I'm not going to offer a firm view, but it's an option. It's a different map type that you could deploy should you wish. Okay, let's go into contours. Now it kind of fascinates me that you know, we look at contour maps fairly regularly in news media for weather mapping, and people seem pretty able to understand what's going on with the weather through that kind of map. But if we think about any other data set that extends across space, we could actually effectively use the data as sample points and then interpolate a surface between those points. And this, to me, gets away from some of those awkward angular county boundaries that create this really harsh border. Now we're getting into, you know, difficult ground here, because those boundaries exist for a reason. They've been drawn there, positioned there, and the voters within a boundary have their votes aggregated up within it. And I understand that their vote doesn't count slightly more on one side of a boundary and slightly less on another. But we could smooth out the map a little bit and create something perhaps just a little bit more interesting, or a bit different. Maybe different is as much as you want to go towards for a map of the election data. So we've got darker lines and spot heights for darker areas of the Republican vote, the share of the vote, and they sort of go down into valleys and then back up to peaks for the Democratic vote. And you kind of see the cliff edges at the coastline of the Democratic vote. And the spot heights have been put on here just really as you would on an atmospheric pressure map or a map of elevation or something. And there's also contour labels on here as well. I zoom in slightly, redraw, and you'll see some of those contour labels coming into view. I kind of like it just because it's different, and one of the reasons for making a map is perhaps to be different. I mean, if absolutely everybody made a Choropleth map with a diverging hue of the election coming up in November, we're going to get very bored of looking at the same map. So different isn't always a bad thing. It can be very useful. Why stick to just contours? Maybe you want to fill those contours. maybe that's a map that the share of the vote that speaks to you a little more. This is almost the filled contour, or we might want to call it an Isotype version of that map that President Trump hung in the White House. It has a very similar appearance, albeit that it's not constrained by those administrative boundaries. And we could go a bit further. We could perhaps start to use some techniques that have a long history, but we've very rarely seen them. We start off with maybe a blended hue background. There's actually quite a lot of different colours going on here because I wanted it just to have a very smooth appearance. And on top of that, we're going to place contours that conceptually have a hill shade applied to them. So they're illuminated with a light source from the top left, and there are shadows in the light source in the bottom right. And to me, that just creates this wonderfully stepped surface that it has an almost 3D effect. Probably utterly useless, right? But, you know, kind of nice to look at. Okay, illuminated contours, sometimes also called Tanaka contours, after the guy who claimed to invent them but didn't. That's another story. Okay, proportional lines. I was playing around with this data and I thought, well, the Choropleth map is trying to look at similarities between areas by shading the area itself. What about trying to look for dissimilarity between places? Perhaps, you know, how your neighbours voted. And I started playing around with this idea of creating proportional lines between adjacent counties. And this was the result. So you get a blue line if you have a neighbour who voted the same. So here we have San Bernardino County, Democratic, bordering other counties surrounding it, also Democratic. A thin line says, well, you're pretty close. A thicker line says, well, you're probably a little bit further apart than you think. And the same with the reds. These black lines are where you're bordering a county that voted differently. So it's Democratic on one side, Republican on another. And the thickness of the line expresses the amount of difference. So basically, you know, if you're in these two neighbouring counties, you probably don't want to talk to each other because you voted fundamentally completely differently. And so you maybe get a sense from the overall map where the dissimilarities exist across the United States, and you get these enclaves of encircled places, which is a kind of another interesting way of just exploring the data. Perhaps my favourite technique experimenting was saying, well, what about putting the data on the map itself? So rather than symbolise everything, why don't we just put the actual data values up themselves? So it makes sense, right? Just put the numbers on the map. Technically, in ArcGIS Pro, it required a little bit of work, and I did borrow the talents of Craig Williams to help with an arcade expression that basically created a symbol size for each of these label components, and also apply a colour to it to sort of mute it towards the background or to bring it to the front. Really just to apply all sorts of secondary visual variables to emphasize some of the peaks and the troughs in the data set. But I kind of like this, even in the congested areas. You can still pick out every single piece of information off the map. And you don't even need to go to a legend to try to interpret the colours, the shades, the pattern, whatever else it might be. You just look at the map and get the data back from it. Difficult to put place labels on, admittedly, but of course we can hide a lot of stuff in a pop-up, so you could click on this map and recover data using that, should you wish. Okay, we're now going to get into some of the slightly more bizarre stuff, just for maybe 15 or so minutes, and then I'll kind of take any questions towards the end. So the problem with some of the election data is that you have a lot of outliers, and that's a problem with a lot of data sets. So why not use two techniques? So this map, I don't know what you call it, but it's some sort of mashup. It uses a dot density technique for most of the counties, and it uses proportional symbols for, I think it's something like the top 50 out of the 3,142 or something counties that exist in the US. Now, I deliberately stylized it. I wanted to riff off an old map that I'd seen once where it used sort of globes on a tilt for proportional symbols. You could choose just much more sensible geometric symbols instead. But you're not limited to one mapping technique when you decide to make a thematic map. You could very easily just take two different techniques. Maybe a Choropleth underlay with a proportional symbol overlay, or a dot density underlay with maybe just some flipped counties that you want to pick out as a key piece of information. And if we want to perhaps overcome some of the problems with the Choropleth, with larger geographical areas dominating the map visually, particularly over here in sort of the west, why don't we just mix these two techniques, which is it's a Choropleth for counties of areas up to a certain size, and beyond that it's a symbol of equivalent size that takes on the same shade. That has the effect of subduing the larger geographies, the larger counties, and it makes a kind of a more balanced view of the map and of the data. Why did I pick circles? Well, if I'd have picked little squares, they might actually have taken on the appearance of the regular gridded pattern that many US counties take on. So I deliberately went with a circle instead. I'm a big fan of Isotype. This is a whole Isotype language, and here's a first view of a map that I made fairly recently, where each symbol is equivalent to 250,000 voters, and they're distributed broadly where people live and work in the United States. And I guess this might be the sort of map you would see in a newspaper rather than some sort of research paper looking at the nuance in the data. It's overly simplified, heavily generalized graphic, but people can get a fair sense of the distribution of the colouring and the distribution of the voting pattern. Okay. Then I started thinking, well, what about some grids? What are these? Circles, the share of the vote. And some of these I'm just going to go through really quickly, not even really offer an opinion, because some of these are experiments. So that's changing the size of a circle. This is changing the shade of a circle. This is using squares with a blended hue. These are becoming more graphic than cartographic, I guess. And that really was just a way into just making you extremely nervous for the map that you will either love or hate. Turn the base map off. See, I love cartograms. I think they're wonderful. And I think they modify geography to present data very efficiently. But you might hate it, because the idea of being able to find where on earth anywhere is can be extremely difficult, particularly on this one, the Gassner-Newman cartogram. Really, really difficult. And do you want your geography warped quite like that? I don't know. So if you're tuning in from kind of the Europe or Britain, I call this a Marmite map. And people either love or hate Marmite on toast. And this is one of those maps that seems to invoke that kind of view. You either love it or you hate it. All right, maybe we go to something a little less challenging. Okay, this is a non-contiguous cartogram, so it retains the familiar shapes, and it just basically resizes them according to, in this case, total vote. No, it's not. In this case, it's electoral college votes, and then shaded according to the share of vote. And maybe we then go to the really graphic Dawling cartogram. And this is the first time this map's been seen. This is product of a little tool set that we're working on here at Esri to create cartograms. And this dawning cartogram is now, we've now got it working with the counties of the United States. So you can see very, very clearly a lot of the Republican strongholds, small population sizes, but a lot of them. And a lot of the Democratic strongholds, fairly big population sizes, but much, much fewer. And the effect of that sort of western area before you get over to the west coast here, you know, that kind of squeeze in the middle, where there really isn't a massive amount of population. Don't like circles? What about squares? Don't like squares? What about hexagons? So there's all sorts of ways in which we can create a cartogram, which is really a graphic impression of the data that we're looking at. Maybe you don't like them nested, maybe you want to go non-contiguous gridded. And these are electoral college votes, so the number of hexagons you're seeing is per the number of electoral college votes for each of the states. And you might even get a little bit playful. I made this a couple of years ago, and loath to zoom in too much, but I'm just going to because it was fun. I basically created a whole series of tessellating. Ooh, yeah, that's not rendering nicely. Let's go back out. Tessellating Trumps and Clintons, and had them fit together, just like an Escher diagram or illustration, if you're familiar with the work of the graphic artist Escher. And I kind of liked it, but you know, it's not got much of a practical purpose, I have to admit. And sometimes you make these maps just as an experiment, and you know, you kind of look at it at the end and you go, well, yeah, okay, technically you achieve something, and you know, can I use this anywhere? Not really. I mean, you know, you use it just to get a cheap laugh, really, just because it's Trump and Clinton in cartoon land on a map. Okay, and here's a map you won't have seen before. This is using the county-based dawning cartogram and mashing it up with a Chernoff face symbology, where different components of the face take on different attributes in the data. And again, this is a function of this little toolbox that we're putting together. And you see here the different aspects of the face say something about the proportion of educational attainment, socioeconomic status, health outcome, and quality of life, with a shade according to the election results. So you could use this just to explore. Now, there's lots of contentious debate about Chernoff faces, and now's not the time to go into them, but it is a technique, and certainly you can change the shape of the face to be more cartoon-like, perhaps, or using different characterizations altogether. There's clearly some obvious attributes in terms of symbology you would want to avoid with a map like this. Okay, there we go now. Compromise cartogram. This was actually created by the Financial Times. And I kind of liked it because they use a geographical background but with repeatable shapes on top, and that to me is a perfect blend of enabling people to look at a count or a graphic of the data or the data value, but also be able to link it and embed it back to the geography that they're familiar with. So broadly speaking, these clusters of dots, each of which is an electoral college vote, is situated within the state state that it belongs to. So as a compromise, it's kind of a non-contiguous cartogram, but sat across a geography. And you could almost say the same about this approach, which we call waffle grids. People like repetition and are able to count very easily. So getting away from just purely looking at an abstract size for, let's say, a circular symbol, maybe repeatable shapes in some ways a little bit Isotype-like, but here we can count up the number of Democratic votes, the number of Republican votes, the number of votes for others, and it gives a fairly good impression. So actually, interesting this, because Trump obviously won, but the popular vote went to Clinton. And if you squint at this map a little bit, you probably see a little bit more blue than you do red, which would indicate that. But that's a whole different system, and that's not how the Republicans won that election. But it tells a different story. Vertical stripes. I hate this, but again, it was kind of a technical challenge. It's almost like a spatial histogram, and you fill in with pattern fills the proportion of Republican vote, the proportion of Democratic vote, and now finally the proportion of other votes into the mix. And actually you can see Utah picks out pretty well there, because there's a large proportion of other votes going on in that particular state for 2016. I don't like it because it almost gives me a migraine. It's like a sort of a visual noise gone crazy. Just as I would sort of argue that maybe a half-tone approach does very similar things to your eyes by using offset old-school printing technology fills, really. You create a half-tone impression of the data across the map. Everyone loves swingometers, don't they? Eh? Needles pointing left, needles pointing right. Well, we can also play with needles on a map like this. There they go. Or maybe you just want to see left or right. Or maybe you don't if it doesn't draw. There we go. So the quantity of the shift in vote from left to right or right to left, plus the intensity through some shade of colour on the arrow, just to emphasise certain places. Okay, forgotten what peaks and valleys is. So let's put it on. Ah, yes, this is the Washington Post example. I thought this was wonderful. It was kind of just mountains of a landscape, and they actually did it span 90 degrees left or counterclockwise to fit a scrolly telling. But I loved the example, and the use of a little bit of transparency and putting certain symbols in front of others, a little emphasis in the background of red or blue. It just gives this wonderful sort of sense of this landscape of mountains of voters. So I just thought, well, taking cues from other people's work, which is what a lot of really good cartography does. This was a lovely map, and I thought I need to find out how to recreate this. So went ahead and did it. Okay, I've only got a few more minutes left. I'm going to show you some gridded charts to finish things off, and what I will do is hang around after the hour for questions, and obviously those of you that want to go off to a different presentation during today's schedule, please do, but I'm more than happy for you to email me or ping me on Twitter or something with questions. I decided, I hope I remember to say this at the start, I was going to take questions at the end rather than all the way through, just because we probably would only have got through 3 or 4 maps otherwise. So, pie charts, 2-segment pie charts, can't stand them. But, if you look at them from 1920 in the bottom left to 2016 in the top right for each county, you do see distributions and different patterns emerging across the map. Is that better than maybe looking at Waffles, who won the state in a particular year? And this is a technique that now shows how to map over time, not just a static single year. Maybe a line chart does that better. Maybe a coxcomb perhaps does it better. If we take 1920 at the top, and we work all the way around to 2016. And each of these segments shows the proportion of votes for Republican, Democrat, or other in that particular year. And so you can encode an awful lot of information as symbol and have it do a reasonable job on a map, but you tend to have to go a little bit more graphic than cartographic, or geographic, I guess, if you're going to do that kind of thing. And then you can get into some of the experimental stuff. Tree rings. Previous years in the middle, outer rings on the outer edge. Okay, and I'll leave you with small multiples. Again, temporal information is very well handled when you start to place different maps in a gridded sequence. So this is 1920, I believe, up in the top, and 24, 28, 32, and so on. And you read it down to 2016 in the bottom right. So each of the maps gives a single picture of each year, but it's all in a single view. So you know, that starts to help really allow people to compare perhaps 2 years, either two side-by-side years. So you know, the Trump Clinton and Obama Romney, perhaps what the differences were there, or even between now and maybe, I don't know, 40, 50 years ago as well. So I'm going to leave you with small multiples. We're not going to go anywhere near 3D because it was basically slowing my entire system down. But I'm nearly up to time. So before I sort of ask if there's any questions, then firstly I'd like to thank you all very much for joining me. I hope we got through some of the little wobbles at the start with the technology, and you've not just been looking at a blank screen for the last hour. That's all I hope, really. Okay, if you want to go off and search for the next presentation, please do feel free. I'm going to hang around here in the chat window for a little while yet and answer a few questions. So once again, thank you very much for joining me for this how to do map stuff, and I'd like to thank Daniel for putting it on. I think it's brilliant. I watched a lot of sessions this morning, and they were great fun. Okay, so let's dive into some of the questions. Okay, I'm going to work from the sort of nearest, because these, when you anticipate the cartogram toolset be available in ArcMap or Arc, it will be in ArcGIS Pro, and it will be as soon as one of my colleagues has it bubbled to the surface past far more important work. That's as much as I'm going to say. If you go to some of the recent blogs, we've actually released the Waffle grid tool and the Coxcomb tool, and some of the other cartogram tools will come along, but you can get those two now. Let's see. Okay, Dave Miller liked proportional text. Yeah, I do too. I think that's nice. I like the idea of data on a map. Let's see. Amy, would you ever consider it appropriate to map percentages with proportional symbols? Yeah, I don't have a problem with that. It's fine. I think for most of those kind of issues, I think a clarification in the legend, just to say what you've done, how you've processed the data, and why, and what it allows you to see in it is useful. I mean, as I go back to it, it's really only totals on a Choropleth that are really problematic, but proportional symbols work okay with percentages. They're not maybe as intuitive, but not necessarily a problem. Okay, people like the blue-brown border. Thanks, because this is going into the book I'm writing, and I can't change it now because they're all printed, as in the pages have been exported. Although one or two people have said the blue for the coastline does look a little bit like democratic blue on some of the maps, so it could shift perception a little bit to suggest that there's more blue on the map. But that was kind of just a design decision. I wanted the map as a thematic to sit above the background, and you can only really do that by having some sort of border or some way of differentiating it from the background. Okay, let's provide a link to the cover map. So the cover map, it's, if you go and have a look on Twitter, on my Twitter profile at Kenneth Field, all one word, you'll see me. I've tweeted that image out a few times. I'm hoping it's going to be the cover of the second book, but it's not been approved yet, so neither the title nor the cover are in any way official. But you know what? If we use it often enough, maybe it'll end up being the cover. So who knows? It took me an awful long time to make those, so hopefully it'll work. Let's see how to make a pi symbol. How to make a pi symbol is actually pretty easy in the latest version of ArcGIS Pro, because it supports graphs and charts, and pi symbols are in there. So certainly if you're an ArcGIS Pro user, you can get that immediately. I'm afraid I don't know about other mapping platforms. I've seen a lot of maps with charts on them. I'm quite sure you can use different mapping platforms to make them, but yes, ArcGIS Pro, it's out of the box, make pie charts. Share how I made the blue-brown border shading. It's basically a vignette, which is a multiple ring buffer of about 20 different distances, and then just shaded with different shades of colour to kind of make it appear to feather out into the background of white. Do one for the brown, do one from the blue, and then I did a manual edit to basically chop out the opposing parts. So I didn't want the brown on the coastline bit, and I didn't want the water on the land bit, and it just sort of fits together. So otherwise it's called a hack. Okay. Steve is asking about mixing techniques, so I tell you what I'll do. Since he stayed up well past his bedtime, did I have it in here? I think I stacked maps, it's called. Did I take it out? I took it out. I did have an example in here where I had the county diverging hue Choropleth, and across the top was a whole series of very thin white outlined proportional symbols for total vote. And I took it out because it was a bit of a mess. So, you know, I didn't necessarily want to throw out too many anti-patterns here, but that would have been one example. Okay, do you use circle radius or circle surface when using circles? Technically speaking, for a circle, it's the area that's set up as a ratio with your data. So it's square root of the data value with an exponent that scales them all up or all down. That's how that works. Okay, J Mr. or JMR. Yeah, I did a fireside chat with the Data Visualization Society a couple of weeks ago, or last week actually, and we discussed how popularization of mappings produce more of the same. What could I suggest to cartography students to do something innovative and interesting? Well, just experiment, but you know, just be cognizant of it's experimental on your desktop, and sometimes experiments don't get published and shouldn't get published. And you know, I haven't shown you an entire separate set of maps here that are just awful, because frankly some don't work. But do experiment, and sometimes you'll hit a real gem. The other thing I would say is don't try to necessarily be too different. You know, if you apply decent principles to just some of the basic core conceptual maps, the Choropleth, proportional symbol, dot density, you know, the out-of-the-box techniques, do them well, there's nothing wrong with that. That's good cartography in my book. Dave Miller, Great hack. Is that my cough, or is that a particular map? Do you have a preference on all of these mapping techniques for this data set? Yeah, it's the proportional text, I think. Just because it's interesting. It's literal. There's no, you don't have to decode anything. And part of good cartography is, you know, making stuff that the eyes can interpret sensibly, and then they tell the brain the right thing. And if you've got the numbers on the map, then it's very difficult to confuse it. So that's probably my favourite. Yeah. Okay. I think questions are kind of drying up. So okay. All right. There's one last question. How did I create the contiguous cartograms? We have a tool here at Esri that allows us to build those maps, and they're going to be shared as a geoprocessing tool set at some point in the near future. We're probably about 3/4 of the way through it, and we'd rather release most of it as one big block than a whole series of bits. If you're still using ArcMap, and particularly older versions of ArcMap, you can do a little Google search and you can find some old ArcMap scripts that will create that contiguous cartogram, and there are also some online tools like Toad, if it still works, that you can upload a shapefile or a data set and it will convert it into a contiguous cartogram and give it back to you in a spatial data set that you can plug into your mapping software. Okay, that's it. No more questions. Everyone's gone. That's great. I'm going to go off and watch John Nelson's now, see whether he had some technical issues. So thanks for joining me. Bye-bye.